Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today I'm joined by Mashal Awais, Watershed Specialist with the Bayou City Waterkeeper. We'll be talking about why environmental justice needs to be at the center of conversations about tackling the climate crisis. Originally from Lahore, Pakistan, she has a master's degree in environmental analysis from Rice University. Mashal's work has focused on risk management and disaster recovery and mitigating the health impacts from environmental pollution for fenceline and underinvested communities. Mashal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought if you could just start out by telling us a bit about Bayou City Waterkeeper.
Sure, yeah. Bayou City Waterkeeper is an organization that works in the Houston area. We work to protect and restore our bayous, rivers, streams, and wetlands throughout the Lower Galveston Bay Watershed. Our work focuses its effort in, three key areas: clean water, protecting our wetlands, and building resilient communities. I can dive into each of these later as we go along with the conversation. And just to add, we utilize advocacy, policy, science, and the law to hold polluters accountable and work towards our goal of fishable, swimmable, drinkable water for all. We address water quality issues ranging from sampling and monitoring to tracking sources of water pollution and working with decision makers on improving Texas water quality standards and watershed protection plans.
Well, that's a great mission, and thank you for sort of sharing that. I think that, we'll be talking about how you all work on some of that more throughout the rest of the interview, but I wonder if you could actually just start by kind of focusing in on this word that you used, watershed. What is a watershed, and particularly what is the Lower Galveston watershed?
Sure. So watershed is the area of land that drains into a water body. In the case of Galveston Bay, the entire watershed is composed of all the smaller watersheds and its tributaries. The Trinity River, the San Jacinto River, all of the creeks and the bayous that feed into the rivers or directly into the bay, plus including the land that drains directly into the bay. So the easiest way for us to see a watershed is if you're standing outside, just look down and you're standing in a watershed. So even if it's the ground, that's also included as part of the watershed because all the water that gets drained from that ground will eventually drain into and is comprised of the watershed. When it comes to the Lower Galveston Bay Watershed, it's defined as approximately around 4,000 square miles of area draining to the bay downstream with two major impoundments, Lake Houston on the San Jacinto River and Lake Livingston on the Trinity River.
So why is this a sort of particularly helpful way to think about kind of an area when we're thinking about climate justice? Because I know like a number of other organizations across the country also sort of do organizing around watersheds.
So our work probably works in tandem with all of the other organizations that work to protect and conserve watersheds. But when we're looking at, for example, Harris County and the greater Houston area, we have one of the most diverse populations in the United States. And so when we're looking at the climate crisis, I guess certain communities in the Houston area or the greater Houston area get impacted by the climate crisis a little bit differently. So I guess the most recent example, or I guess there's plenty of recent examples that we can talk about, but if we're looking at Hurricane Harvey and the impact that Hurricane Harvey had in Houston as a hurricane event, which is, as we know, with climate change and climate crisis, hurricanes are going to be more intense and more frequent. So with that, there's particular communities that are identified to be more vulnerable to climate change and climate-related disasters. So I guess when we're coming up with building or having conversations about building resilient communities, incorporating that narrative of which communities are considered more vulnerable in the wake of climate change is, I guess, a part of the work. So like I mentioned, when when we're looking at building resilient communities, or when we're having conversations with community members, I guess my background is in the sciences, but when I'm talking to policy experts and community members, I'm kind of sort of trying to bridge that gap into making community members a part of the decision-making process, because oftentimes that narrative is lost, or we'll look at certain communities and not weigh in as what they would envision a recovery for them, I guess, in a particular disaster related event. So when it comes to disaster recovery, I guess one of the biggest things that I like to focus on is what does recovery look like for community members? Do they actually want to continue living in the same area knowing that that's going to flood year after year, or would they like to be relocated to a different area? And how do they as community members define community? So all of that sort of gets missed when we're looking at big picture sort of hurricane level analysis, especially in the scale of something like Hurricane Harvey. But I guess for community members in Houston that are faced with a disaster after a disaster, and of course we're living in a pandemic and we just witnessed the winter storm, it's all the same community members that get impacted. And we can say that the winter storm was also sort of like a man-made disaster, because community members that got impacted, they weren't prepared for anything like that, and I guess the infrastructure wasn't there as well to accommodate for that. So I guess all of that gets put together when we're talking about building resilient communities.
Well, it seems like what you're talking about on some level is infrastructure, and on some level is community choice in terms of thinking about resilient communities, right? Because if we take the example of the recent winter storm, I mean, that is a result of infrastructure problems, not, I mean, sure, it's weather related, but like it's because decisions were made and continue to be made by the Texas legislature and the governor of Texas and various other state agencies that they control about systematically underinvesting in the Texas grid system and not incorporating the Texas grid system into the national grid, right? So it's a series of policy decisions that led to the disaster, and can be, I think, certainly understood from an economic justice and a racial justice lens. And I know that you've kind of worked on trying to focus on racism within the context of climate justice and disaster recovery. And how has that played out in Houston? Because I know that your work is locally focused here, like either with Bayou City Waterkeeper, or what you've done in the past, or just kind of what has happened within the community writ large.
So with regards to the winter storm, I think I'd like to add also there's like outdated infrastructure that exists in what we have identified, or what is identified as vulnerable communities or underinvested communities, right? So if it's a plumbing issue, it's all of those old neighborhoods in Houston that have historically been underinvested. And when we look at that, it's the same communities, right? So a lot of the work actually that I've done through being involved in community organizations such as West Street Recovery and SEER and now Bayou City Waterkeeper, I guess it's also really encouraging to see so many organizations come together to do this type of work, and we're trying to uplift and bring to center the same communities, right? Because it's the same communities that get impacted. And I know I might be saying the same thing over and over, but I think it takes a little bit of repeating that it is the same communities. And when I say that, I think for myself, the work that I've done is in the North Side, Greater Fifth Ward. And when it comes to doing work around environmental justice, it's been our frontline communities on the east side of Houston. So a lot of those communities are marginalized, low-income neighborhoods, historically Black and brown communities of color. And that's there's a lot of historic racism that went into, I guess, the way Houston was built when it was laid out. And I guess most people listening to this would be familiar with the term redlining, and sort of how neighborhoods got shaped when they did in the beginning. So that sort of continues to persist in how we see environmental impacts within Houston area, or now climate related impacts um, regarding who gets faced with the impact the most.
So I think one of the things that you wanted to focus on this conversation was whether it's possible to find local solutions to these big unfathomable problems like the climate crisis. I mean, especially because, I mean, I would argue as a non-native Texan that the climate, like that Houston writ large is in some ways a vulnerable community because of, the distance to Galveston and the way in which we will continually be pounded by hurricanes over the next however many, years. Um, so how can, or is it possible for those of us in Houston to find local solutions to something like the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's something that I enjoy thinking about, in the sense of like I really like to focus on being able to have those solution oriented conversations, because sometimes the climate crisis can look so huge and so daunting, especially like you mentioned for Houston, right? We at some point are all facing the climate crisis together, because we are we're located geographically at such a vulnerable location. So um, I think when coming up with solutions or having conversations with community members, it's also key to recognize that community members, um, depending on where they live, they will have their own sort of identified concept of what a solution would look like.
Hmm.
And so being able to incorporate that, I think that's really, for me, I think that's really cool. Is like, how can, or is a question that I like to solve or be able to address, is like, how can we find local solutions, and what would like a local solution look like for greater Fifth Ward area versus like Sugarland, because they're different, they're in proximity to different rivers and bayous, so the flooding is different, and some of the way that the emergency management is different. So coming up with like local solutions, and I think having conversations with community members, recognizing that or listening to community members, I've learned that they oftentimes have solutions. It's just that those solutions don't get to be presented at the table, and they don't get passed. So being able to come up with decentralized solutions and being able to empower community members to be able to find solutions for themselves and invest in those solutions, I think that would be really, really key, and something that I'd like to see happen.
Do you have an example of that? I mean, I think that that's such a wonderful idea, and do you have an example of kind of when that's I don't even want to say worked, but kind of that process has at least started to take place, either here in Houston or nationally?
Yeah, I think one of the most inspiring stories for me is like the Northeast Action Collective is a group of community members based out of the greater Fifth Ward North Side area, and I've been privileged to work with them through West Street Recovery a little bit, and understanding how they are empowering their own community and finding solutions for themselves for um, the next climate crisis. Because I think for community members, it's also, aid comes really few and far between, and it's oftentimes way later than when they need it. So for community members such as Northeast Action Collective, it's been really empowering to see how they can pull together their own resources and identify solutions that they can build on from within what they have in their community, and then really be their own advocates um, to find solutions, whether it's being able to come up with like a local evacuation strategy for themselves, or have sufficient, I mean, I'm not sure if this is exactly what they're doing at this moment when they're strategizing, but
Uh-huh.
I feel like having sort of those local decentralized solutions is really impactful.
Mm.
So whether it's like an emergency evacuation for my community and my zip code or something like that, I think that that level of thinking and that level of innovation is needed from every community member to be able to address what I guess looks like a climate crisis that doesn't seem to pause.
Hmm. So really, not thinking that you're going to be able to rely on city or state officials, but thinking about how you as a community, local community, can respond immediately or control the things that you can control, I suppose.
Yeah, being able to work, and then eventually, obviously, being able to work with city and county officials and state officials.
So, do you have an example of either how that has worked on a policy level here in, well, I mean, here in Houston or in Texas, or not worked? I mean, like, unfortunately, I think that we like the inspiring stories, but some of the truth about some of the stuff you're talking about is actually very much related to people trying to be listened to and being ignored by local, state, and federal officials. So I mean, either a positive example or a negative example on the policy level.
I wish something came to my mind immediately, but as of this point, I feel like I don't have a direct example right now, but I'm sure I can share something with you later. But yes, generally to say that these community conversations or these solutions come probably due to the fact that there hasn't been timely aid coming into those communities, right? So it is that sort of not being heard narrative that brings about communities finding solutions for themselves. And I think one example would be, I mean, for being able to have your home flooded in the example of Hurricane Harvey, and then not having to hear from anyone as to what is next for them to be able to do. Do they now go, will FEMA will provide, you know, um, housing? Sometimes that housing is 30 minutes away, and that's just the challenge of like something with the scale of Hurricane Harvey when it hit Houston. But for example, for community members to have to commute then 30 minutes from where FEMA has given them accommodation, and then having to come in to rebuild their homes, or finding contractors to rebuild homes, and then those contractors might not do really good job. So there's a lot of like sort of compounding gaps that will perpetuate and delay recovery for community members. So I think I don't know if that's like a specific example, policy based or policy related, but I think those are gaps in policy and sort of like um, disaster recovery framework.
I mean, that seems like it's a huge gap in policy, right? If because the decision to rebuild this FEMA housing 30 minutes away, I mean, that is a policy decision. I mean, somebody is making that decision based on policies that have been created by FEMA or laws that have passed. I mean, this is not my area of specialty, so obviously I don't know. But, clearly there is some criteria under which those decisions have to be made, and that criteria allows housing to be developed 30 minutes away. And I'm assuming you mean 30 minutes away by car, not by like public transit or walking.
Yes, just for clarification, the hotel accommodation that people get once their homes get flooded, I'm forgetting the technical term, I'm sure. So it's been a while, but I guess when people get flooded, then they relocate, like FEMA relocates them to temporary housing, and that temporary housing can be really far away, and then people that get completely flooded will often not have transportation. They won't be able to go from point A to point B, and so there's sort of like those type of gaps in the temporary housing policy framework. And then when it comes to rebuilding the framework and like FEMA, how FEMA will allot money to homes that need to be repaired or restored or completely rebuilt. Sometimes that will not actually be the true cost of the repairs, so then people have to dig into their savings. And so there's all these types of conversations, and And especially when we're talking about low-income communities, that's really big dents that oftentimes people aren't able to recover from.
And it's, I think, very hard to, in a lot of cases, for people to advocate for themselves in any kind of organized way, even
Yes.
when dealing with these entities, right? Because they're sort of big.
And it's definitely not easy. Sometimes even I get lost in the language and the jargon and the paperwork and all of this stuff. So it's definitely not easy to be experiencing the trauma of displacement and having to figure out next steps.
So, I mean, you're a professional, and one of the questions that you wanted to sort of, or things that you wanted us to think about, was kind of how do professionals such as yourself engage with communities during this time to both to create space for youth engagement and youth leadership, and I think community empowerment, right? So to help them navigate through these kind of crises.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was getting my master's degree was obviously being around so many incredible technical experts and scientists and engineers. And at that time, I was doing my internship with DEHAS, which is an environmental justice organization focusing on communities such as Manchester and Galena Park. And for context, those are frontline communities that live really in close proximity to petrochemical refineries. So I at that point I was noticing this type of like how do we bring these conversations together when community members are saying, hey, we're getting poisoned because of emissions, and then I feel like at that point I wanted to be able to have more people in the room listening to those conversations, because oftentimes when we're coming up with policies, or as scientists and engineers we're coming up with technical plans, we're maybe not able to capture the full extent of what a community can experience 30 years down the line from when a plant gets put in place, right? So from that perspective, I feel like it's really important for me, I think, to be able to continue being in conversations with community members, especially where we are where we are doing the work. So if there's like a chemical plant that you're managing, for example, as an engineer on site, then what is the community that's surrounding that, and how is that relationship built, right? And of course, it's not the job of an engineer. I guess there's so many other people that get tasked with that. But I think it's really helpful to be able to have that sort of relationship with community members, to be able to learn from what they experience when they're in close proximity to an industrial site. And I guess when it comes to Houston, we don't have any zoning, so there is industry almost everywhere. So I guess in everyone's backyard, if you dive a little bit deeper, there's like within a 10-mile radius, there's certainly something that can be of exposing you to a certain amount of risk, whether that's chemical safety or wastewater treatment plants or something like that. So I think being able to have conversations with community members and engaging with young people especially, and educating them as well as we build and improve upon our systems, I think that that's really valuable. And maybe that'll bridge gaps so we don't have so many gaps later in the future. I guess that's my motivation.
So you're really saying that the community needs to be empowered to be part of the planning process, right? So not just the planning process is done by people with technical expertise, but that they are taking, I mean, the community expertise, the community knowledge into account when these planning conversations about how to mitigate the climate crisis are taking place.
Yes, and I think the communication is like a two-way process. Risk communication is a two-way process. Having conversation to build and have decision makers be a part, community members be a part of the decision making process. It's all part of the same conversation, I think. So the more community engagement we get at the forefront of the planning process, I think the better systems we can put in place that are more protective of human health. Because at the end of the day, that's the thing that gets compromised, right?
Right. I mean, that's, I guess, what is at the center of the whole conversation, right? Really, human health and ecological sustainability, the health of our planet
Mm-hmm.
and our ecosphere.
Absolutely.
I feel like there's always sort of more to say about the challenge of like incorporating racial justice into conversations around confronting the climate crisis, because unfortunately so many of the like big environmental justice or environmental organizations have kind of challenging legacies around environmental racism.
Yeah, and thanks so much for bringing that point to the forefront, right? That's a really great, um, I guess you put it really nicely, like conservation without people, and that's a huge, I guess, piece of the narrative as well, right? Like when we're looking at this land, I guess, when we're looking at Texas, I guess the further you go into history, you'll realize that there's a huge history of indigenous populations that used to live here and what those conservation efforts used to look like. And there's a lot of really incredible conversations happening now globally about what conservation strategies historically have worked, and where forests have been preserved the most is not necessarily where we think of traditional, more recent models of conservation as like such as national parks and national forests, but all over the globe, if it's indigenous people that are living in that forest, we can look at the Amazon or so many other places in Asia, that those forests have been preserved because of the people that are living in those forests. So there's a conversation to be had about like, well, indigenous people preserve land in a way that's more protective and more sustainable in certain ways. So there's definitely ways that we can pull from that as well. Even when we're looking at, the Galveston area, the Greater Galveston area, and the Houston area, where how Indigenous people used to protect the prairies and do intentional fires to do prairie restoration work. So there's all sorts of conversations to be had about how we can bring in the Indigenous lens as well when doing conservation or like strategy building.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that like if you look at California, right, this is like one of the big problems with California is that for millennium, the California forests, the redwoods, and all up and down the coast were maintained in the, by indigenous communities using controlled burns, right? And so much of what's happening with these disastrous climate driven fires that are just destroying tens of thousands of acres of forest is because indigenous communities are no longer maintaining the land, and indigenous techniques for maintaining the land have been abandoned. And the results are disastrous for both forest and human.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's there's great solutions that we can bring, right? If we just include, to your point, like wealthy communities will find and figure out a way, but when all said and done, it's the communities that, well, for when we're looking at indigenous communities or people that live with the forest, I guess, living with the forest, in the forest, and that's their entire life, right? For them, it's not about relocating, or it's not about mitigating to a different location or relocating to a different location. So they have a very unique perspective on what that conservation lens could look like, and we've I think really building back that narrative as soon as possible into our conservation strategy would be a way to move forward for sure.
Well, thank you, Mashal, for being with us today and for being a great guest. I hope that you'll be able to come visit us sometime when we are meeting again in person.
I would love that. Yes, I can't wait for things to change and for us to be able to interact more in person.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for having me today. This was really a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. And for those of you who are watching, who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart. the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. This was our second in a 4-part series on environmental justice and the climate crisis that we are holding in the lead up to Earth Day. Next week, I hope you all will join us for a conversation with Patrick Rainsborough, the former grassroots organizing director for 350.org and numerous other environmental justice and environmental organizations. I hope you'll also consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. Next week, this coming Sunday, our assistant minister, the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, will be preaching. I'd like to thank our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.